I'd like to take a moment to introduce Students for Liberty and the e-leadership program for those of you unfamiliar with it. Students for Liberty is a 501c3 nonprofit organization that is run for students and by students dedicated to liberty. We were formed about 2 years ago to serve a previously unfilled niche at our universities by connecting liberty-friendly students with other students, faculty, organizations, and resources to help them advance their ideas. The resources we offer include free books for student groups, a speakers network, protest grants, handbooks on running a student organization, tabling kits, leadership training, and an academic journal. And our bread and butter, of course, is the conferences. The e-leadership program is our way of giving you access to the ideas and mentorship and liberty year-round from wherever you are. We hold 4 webinars per month, 2 on the ideas behind liberty, and 2 on mentorship and effective techniques for advocating liberty. All lectures take place Monday nights at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time from your computer. For a full list, please visit our website at studentsforliberty.org. Now, I am pleased to introduce our speaker for the evening. Dr. Lark is a professor in the School of Engineering and Applied Science at the University of Virginia and serves as advisor for the Liberty Coalition at the university. Dr. Lark is a former national chairman of the Libertarian Party and is the recipient of the Samuel Adams Award given to the most effective activist from the Libertarian Party in 2004, and the Thomas Jefferson Award, the party's highest honor given for lifetime achievement, in 2008. He is a member of the Board of Directors of the International Society for Individual Liberty and the Board of Directors for the Advocates for Self-Government. He is also a member of the Board of Advisors for the Students for Liberty. Just to note, there will be 15 minutes or so of questions and answers, of Q&A at the end of the webinar. Feel free to type any questions you have into the question box, and one of us will field it for Dr. Lark. And without further ado, I present Dr. Lark.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to thank Mr. Niger and Ms. Schneider for their help in setting up this webinar, and I'd like to thank all of you for taking the time and trouble to attend. I hope you'll enjoy my comedic stylings this evening. Let me warn you that I don't know that I'm going to be saying anything that you'll find especially profound. I hope you'll find it interesting and somewhat provocative, but much of what we'll be talking about this evening you may have already considered, so I'll warn you in advance that if you came here expecting to be dazzled by something extraordinarily brilliant, you may be disappointed. Of course, many people would tell you that I'm not going to be capable of giving you anything that would be brilliant. So the title of my address this evening is Challenges to Liberty, Substantive Criticisms and Questions Concerning the Libertarian Perspective. Perhaps a slightly better title would be Challenges for Liberty. What I hope to do this evening is to provide some interesting questions and criticisms about the general libertarian perspective. My main goal is to get you to think about certain matters, certain issues, if you haven't already done so. So let's whip through the PowerPoint presentation, if we may. First, let me switch over here and get this rolling. There we go. The outline of my presentation this evening, I'll give you a brief bit of information about me. Fortunately, Mr. Niger has already given some information about me. I'll offer some general comments about improving the ability of liberty activists to promote the ideas of liberty. I think that's the major intention for these webinars, and I'd like to offer my 2 cents about a couple of points that I think are particularly important. I'll then get into the main topic for the conversation this evening. That's a brief discussion of some substantive challenges to the libertarian perspective, and then I hope to have plenty of time for questions and comments from you. As Mr. Niger mentioned, my name is Jim Lark. I serve as the utility infielder in the School of Engineering and Applied Science at the University of Virginia. My principal appointment's in systems engineering. However, I also teach in applied mathematics and statistics. I also occasionally teach in the McIntire School of Commerce here. I'm a Virginia Tech alum, took my doctorate at UVA, so that makes me a Hokie Who. I had the honor of founding and serving now as the advisor to the Liberty Coalition and its constituent organizations at the University of Virginia. I serve as a member of the Board of Advisors for Students for Liberty. I chair the Board of Directors of the Advocates for Self-Government, and I'm a member of the Board of Directors for the International Society for Individual Liberty. Mr. Niger mentioned my Libertarian Party. I guess you could say my bona fides. I serve as a member of the Libertarian National Committee and had the honor of serving as the chairman of the Libertarian Party during the 2000 to 2002 term. I'm the recipient of the Adams and Jefferson Awards, of which I'm very proud. I don't know if I deserved them, but I'm certainly proud to receive them. The general comments that I always like to offer to those who are advocates of liberty, particularly on college campuses, but pretty much anywhere, are that there are two major aspects. If we want to improve our ability as liberty activists to promote the ideas of a libertarian society, to sell the product, as I've indicated, there are two major points: improving the messenger and improving the message. And as part of both of those, I think it's extremely important that we must observe the highest standards of intellectual integrity and that we must treat people with courtesy and respect. I hope that these 2 points will strike you as extraordinarily obvious. However, in many cases when I've dealt with libertarian activists, I find that in some cases they don't exercise the highest standards of intellectual integrity, nor do they treat people with courtesy and respect. So I realize that it may seem impertinent of me to offer these comments, but I'll do it anyway. I think that these are both extremely important points, and I hope you will share my perspective in this matter. As I said, the purpose of this talk is to identify some of the challenges that I consider to be substantive regarding the libertarian perspective. These criticisms and questions that we'll discuss focus upon what may be potential weaknesses or failings concerning a society that is based on libertarian principles. I believe that in order for us to be taken seriously, we need to be able to answer or at least address these challenges. I don't know in some cases that there are answers. We may not be able to come to or provide answers for people's concerns. That's just the nature of the fact that in many cases people will simply disagree with the libertarian perspective. By the way, some of the challenges that we'll talk about this evening can just as easily be applied to other philosophical systems involving politics. Indeed, in many of the cases, those criticisms that are valid concerning societies based on libertarian principles will apply even more strongly when we look at other philosophical systems, societies that are based on other philosophical principles. Now, let me describe this thing that I call the libertarian perspective. I realize that there's a certain pretentiousness here because some people would say there's no such thing as the libertarian perspective. You have perspectives that are offered by libertarians. The way I look at the libertarian perspective is as follows. I believe that there are basically some axioms, or I subscribe to certain axioms. One is a right of self-ownership or to self-ownership. I also believe that you have a right to own that which you have produced with your own labor and your own property. I also believe it's legitimate to acquire and own heretofore unowned property, and I use the euphemism homesteading to describe this. I also subscribe to some principles about politics, and that is that the rights I've mentioned exist prior to the formation of the institution called government. I believe governments are formed by communities for the protection of rights. To the extent that governments have any legitimacy at all, it is that they are formed by the polity to protect rights. We realize that life is pretty dangerous, that it is full of predation, and in many cases we come together to form governments. Now, I believe governments should be like clubs. There's a double entendre there. I don't mean clubs in the sense of great big sticks. I mean clubs in the sense of people who voluntarily agree to some sort of framework of agreement, which I loosely call a constitutional level of agreement. Another principle to which I subscribe is if a government violates the very rights it was established to protect, its citizens have the right to alter or abolish that government. Of course, Mr. Jefferson is well known for having said something along those lines. I view the libertarian perspective as proceeding from these axiom and principles. My suspicion, based on a lot of time with people who are self-described libertarians, is that they will agree with the first two axioms that I described, self-ownership and the right to own that which you have produced with your own labor and property. The third axiom, the one concerning acquiring heretofore unowned property, is somewhat controversial among people who describe themselves as libertarians, and indeed we could spend an entire webinar, an entire series of webinars describing some of those differences. When I use the phrase the libertarian perspective, I realize that I'm using a phrase that perhaps not all libertarians will agree with my particular way of looking at what the libertarian perspective is. Similarly, I'm going to use the term government with the with the understanding that that term may mean different things to different people. So perhaps if you have questions or comments about the way I'm using these words and phrases, you can bring them up during the question and comment period. The challenges that we're going to talk about are only a few of those that I believe are worthy of consideration, and my discussions are going to be brief, you may say mercifully brief. A proper discussion of each one of these challenges is probably worthy of its own webinar. Again, I suspect that most of you have already considered some, perhaps all of these issues. If so, you may find this perhaps interesting. You may find it actually rather boring. If so, I apologize that I'm wasting your time. So let's get cracking here in terms of this. These challenges that we are going to talk about, I think that these are the ones that I find are particularly important or interesting, so that to some extent they represent my personal preferences. In a couple of cases, perhaps these challenges have not received the attention that maybe they deserve. Incidentally, if I don't address a specific challenge that you might find interesting or important, that should not imply to you that I consider the challenge to be unimportant, or that somehow that challenge in some sense stumps the libertarians, that it serves as a way of in effect providing a fatal blow to the libertarian perspective. So my silence about these things doesn't mean that I don't think they're important or that I think that they are trumps. I haven't cherry-picked the issues that I think are the ones libertarians can deal with most easily. First challenge is what I have referred to as the ownership of land. This, in many ways, is the fundamental issue that separates the people I call libertarians from many people who actually do share a general notion of self-ownership and the idea that you have the right to own the fruits of your labors. The issue is, how can a person justly own land? What allows us to claim a piece of God's little earth as our own? And under what conditions can we justly own land? If we can own land, how do we actually acquire it? How do we actually say this is mine and perhaps this is thine? If I do acquire land, how do I demonstrate that I have acquired it? As it turns out, there are different ways in different societies that people can indicate that they have acquired property, and that recognition seems to be fairly widespread within a given community. Different communities have different ways of recognizing how people acquire and mark their land. If one can own land, does that ownership extend in perpetuity? Do we have to, if we make a claim, if we go out and perhaps build a fence around a piece of property, does our ownership right in that piece of property, does it extend for the rest of time, absent some deliberate action, some purposeful action on the part of the owner, either to maintain or to relinquish that ownership? Many questions arise from the nature of the ownership of land. For example, to what extent can I exclude others from access to my land? If I go out and put a fence around the meadow, it's my meadow, doggone it, can I restrict you from merely walking across the meadow? Let's say that you want to go from point A to point B. You can't get there any other way, or at least it's not really feasible for you to go from A to B except by crossing my meadow. You're not going to do great damage to my meadow. You just simply want to cross over it. You will tread lightly upon the grass. Can I restrict you from it? Another question is, can I restrict you, say, from flying an airplane over my property? When we decide we own a meadow, even if we agree that you can own real property, you can own land, what rights come with that bundle? Can I restrict you from flying an airplane over my property? Can I shoot you down, for example, if you're flying a jet airliner 35,000 feet over my property? Do I have a right to fire a surface-to-air missile and shoot you down for having had the temerity to fly over my property? Does ownership of land establish subsidence rights? For example, if I sink a well and there's water under my property, is that my water? If I drill an oil well, and there's a pool of oil. Is it my property? As a brief aside, my interest in property rights actually traces back, or at least perhaps my thinking about property rights in a coherent fashion actually traces back to watching a presentation by the comedian Gallagher, who some of you, if you're old enough to remember Gallagher and his so-called sledge-o-matic, where he would smash up watermelons with a sledgehammer. Gallagher, during the time of one of the oil embargoes, asked, why is it the Saudi Arabians' oil? Why don't we just drill a big hole under them and suck it out from under them? And I began at that point to think about property rights. For those of you who are old enough to remember the first Iraq War, when the United States went to war against Iraq in 1991, one of the justifications that Iraq gave for invading Kuwait was that the Kuwaitis had drilled oil wells on an angle and were sucking oil out from under the Iraqi territory. So these are questions that actually are very, very important in both lives of citizens and in world affairs. Let's say there's a pool of water under my property, and that pool actually extends under the property of my neighbors. Do I have a right to suck as much water out via my well? Can I suck the pool dry? Do I owe any compensation to others? So issues of subsidence rights, we frequently assume that if we own a bundle of land that it establishes rights, at least some rights overhead and some rights below. Well, how do we justify those? If we can justify ownership of land, does that mean that the current owners, the current regime of property owners, do these owners have legitimate claims to their land? I happen to own a place in Albemarle County, Virginia. It's a very nice piece of land. I like to think it's mine, but can I really establish a valid claim according to libertarian principles that extends into the distant past? I'm not sure I can. If the current owners of property, if they do not have legitimate claims, or if we don't recognize their claims as legitimate, are there others who should have claims on that property? So all of these questions are ones that one can pose of people who talk about a libertarian perspective or who call themselves libertarians. Criticisms of the libertarian perspectives on private land ownership come in many shapes, sizes, and colors. Many of those criticisms involve an issue of morality. In other words, the idea is that you simply have no moral right to carve out a piece of earth, that you have no right to monopolize a particular parcel of earth, particularly or especially since you didn't create that parcel, or in most cases you didn't create that parcel. Many other criticisms of private land ownership are of a prudential nature. In other words, if we allow private ownership, it allows a relative few to, in effect, impose poverty and immiseration upon the many. And this is a criticism that has many, many adherents. Both forms of criticism, both the moral and the prudential forms of criticism, have many, many supporters. And the libertarian perspective on property rights, there are different perspectives. In fact, if you talk to different libertarians, you'll find slightly different feelings. Some libertarians have something of a lock-in perspective. Other libertarians have, say, a Georgist perspective. But regardless of the particular flavor, these perspectives are challenged by others who feel that either the libertarian perspective is not well justified or it has no justification at all. Now, I view this challenge as fundamental. Indeed, in talking to fellow libertarians, I've sometimes referred to ownership of land as sort of the dirty little secret of libertarianism, because in many cases we libertarians have substantial differences among ourselves about the way the property rights actually play out. For whatever it's worth, I have examined many different ways of justifying ownership of land, including those that would not be put under the libertarian rubric. Frankly, I don't find any notion of property ownership to be completely satisfactory, including my own. In fact, I might even say especially my own. None of the justifications that I've seen for private ownership of land cover all the bases, so to speak. And so I tend to look at justifications for land as picking the one that I feel is least bad as opposed to finding the best. You may have different conceptions about this. But again, with respect to the notion of ownership of land, this in many ways is, no pun intended, a bedrock of libertarianism. most libertarians talk about it's my land, you have no right to impose taxes upon my land or the like. So it's very important that you at least give some thought to how do we justify, or at least how do you justify, ownership of private land. One particular note I'd like to make, I mentioned the notion of the George's perspective. I put the George's perspective, the idea that in effect you can have an own land, but you have to pay some sort of tribute or tax to the community by virtue of the fact that you are monopolizing that which was held in common. I find the George's perspective to be particularly interesting. I do put it within the libertarian tradition. I do consider it a libertarian perspective. It's not one that I actually share, although I find it in many ways in some ways a very good perspective. I feel it's more lacking than other perspectives, and perhaps we can talk about this during the question and answer period. The classic work is Henry George's Progress and Poverty, which I've listed here. The second challenge involves a wide variety of what I will refer to as rights-violative actions. And this can be summarized, albeit somewhat imperfectly, as when does your action constitute a violation of my rights? In some cases, we can actually inquire, when does your inaction constitute a violation of my rights? And this involves, by the way, the notion of positive rights. Do I have positive obligations to you in various ways? So it's possible that inaction may actually constitute a violation of rights. Even with negative conception of rights, there may be situations where inaction may cause or lead to a violation of someone else's rights. So again, there are many, many, many questions that we can look at. Let's say that you and I, while we're friends, you have decided that you want to keep your relationship with me completely non-photonic. In other words, you don't want to see me, you don't want me to see you. One can ask if I'm violating your rights if I shine a flashlight on you. And indeed, one might say, gee whiz, these photons that I'm hitting you with when I shine the flash, they're actually hitting you at the speed of light, doggone it. Am I violating your rights? Now, you might think of this as being one of those interesting thought experiments that libertarians and non-libertarians frequently think about when they're plumbing the depths of political philosophy. But there was an interesting example of this several years ago in Albemarle County, Virginia, where I have a house. There was a proposed light shielding ordinance. The idea was that businesses that had bright lights that were shining at night, for example, automobile dealerships that kept floodlights on at night, would be required to place some sort of shielding so that the light would not be projecting upward. We have a small observatory here in Albemarle County that's associated with the University of Virginia. Also, people like me who live out in the county, we kind of like to see the nice, pretty stars at night. And so the idea was that there would be a proposed there was a light shielding ordinance. Now, my initial reaction when I heard this, I'm a member of the Jefferson area Libertarians, the local Libertarian Party group here, was that, my goodness, this is an example of overly large, overly nosy, overly intrusive government. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that I might be engaging in a form of knee-jerk libertarianism, and that there might actually be good property rights-based arguments that one could make for such light shielding ordinances. So again, even when I come up with something that may seem fanciful about the idea of shining a flashlight on you and violating your rights, the principles involved can actually come into graphic relief in dealing with, should, say, libertarians oppose a proposed light shielding ordinance, or should we support it? Is it something that's actually property rights protective? Are there any types of actions such that when we look at that action as an individual action, it would not be considered rights violative, but when we aggregate the actions, somehow this aggregate of actions has deleterious consequences? And if so, is it legitimate to restrict such actions? If so, how would we do it? And in many ways, the prototypical example would be the possibility of human-induced, or the fancy word is anthropogenerated, global warming, as well as other types of what we might refer to as non-source pollution. If I'm the only guy on the planet who has an internal combustion engine and I fire it up on my homestead, I don't know that too many people, assuming that I'm not generating lots of noise with it, I'm not sure that the effluent that comes out of that internal combustion engine would be considered rights violative. In other words, it would tend to dissipate fairly quickly. I'm not sure that too many people would be able to even realize that I fired up my internal combustion engine. However, if you take literally billions of people and perhaps at some point billions of internal combustion engines, is it possible that these activities, when taken in some aggregate fashion, may cause real harm to people? Perhaps by virtue of increased respiratory distress, perhaps by virtue of increasing the mean temperature and thus perhaps causing flooding to low-lying coastal areas, perhaps exaggerating extremes in weather. So how would we deal with issues if we have an action that in and of itself is generally not considered rights violative, but perhaps in some sort of aggregate sense? So I think that these are appropriate questions. And even if we do decide that it is appropriate to restrict such actions, how do we do it? Are there better or worse ways of doing it? Incidentally, criticisms of the libertarian perspective involving the combination of property rights and rights violative actions frequently will involve assertions that the current property rights definitions are in some sense inadequate, or that market interactions will not provide the appropriate protection of people against harm. And some of you may be aware that there's a non-trivial movement out there that argues that, for example, the market price of gasoline that you pay at the pump doesn't reflect its full social cost, that if we actually imposed say taxes on the price of gasoline so that we could mitigate whatever unfortunate consequences are the results of people using gasoline and internal combustion engines, perhaps that full social cost, if we bring the market price up to full social cost, we would have a much better society, because people who use internal combustion engines to drive around would be paying the full cost. And incidentally, why I'm not convinced that those who are arguing that the market price of gasoline in this country or other countries doesn't reflect its full social cost. I think that this is an assertion that we of libertarian disposition, we need to look at and consider seriously, because there is something there that, at the very least, if we don't agree, we ought to know why we don't agree. In addressing challenges involving, say, things such as pollution, environmental trespass, many view what I'll call the common law as an institution that may be particularly useful to deal with this. I was in Milan, Italy at the European Liberty Conference last week, and John Hosnes of Georgetown University, many of you may know Professor Hosnes, makes a very interesting case for the use of the common law as an appropriate mechanism for dealing with some of these problems. By the way, common law need not be administered through some sort of governmental court arrangement. It is possible for common law to emerge from purely market or voluntary arrangements. And Dr. Hosnes has provided what I think is a very interesting case for the use of the common law in dealing with matters of, say, environmental problems. A big issue that I think perhaps does not receive enough attention among libertarians concerns the issue of prior restraint. Am I allowed to use prior restraint to keep you from taking actions that might cause serious damage to me? For example, let's say that you send away for your little atomic bomb kit that you can get through, you read comic books, in the back of a comic book there's an ad, you can buy an atomic bomb kit. The ad comes with the tagline, "Be the first kid on your block to rule the world." So you buy your atomic bomb kit and you start putting it together. I see that you're assembling an atomic bomb, and oh, by the way, it doesn't appear that you're actually particularly dexterous. I happen to see the possibility that you are going to end up blowing up you and me as well. Do I have the ability, should I have the ability, to use some form of prior restraint to keep you from engaging in actions? Let's say I want to put up an oil refinery or a nuclear power plant next to your home. Is it legitimate to insist that I have to engineer my power plant, or let's say I'm just building a home and I use a very interesting architectural design that when you see it, it looks to you as if it's going to blow apart easily in a windstorm and the pieces of your house are going to come crashing into your house. Is it appropriate to use some form of regulation, some form of prior restraint to keep you from engaging in actions that clearly may have serious consequences if something goes wrong? And should we use a concept that is known as reckless endangerment to deal with such questions? In other words, is your behavior of a nature such that perhaps, strictly speaking, it is not rights violative, but clearly your behavior may lead to all sorts of horrible consequences? Is it appropriate to use a concept of reckless endangerment? Okay. Perhaps an example of this would be, let's say that I point a pistol at your stomach. I show no sign that I'm actually going to fire the pistol, but I'm just pointing that pistol at your stomach. Have I violated your rights? Okay. A related question, are you required to wait until I fire before you take any form of defensive action? Okay. And by defensive action in this case, I don't mean simply moving away at a rapid pace, running like hell to get out of the way. I'm talking about, for example, can you unholster your weapon to fire away? If I fire a bullet at you and I don't hit you, I just I fire a bullet over your shoulder, you may not know whether I was intending to hit you or not. Have I violated your rights? Now again, some of these questions may seem a little silly, but I think they get down to, or they actually go to the heart of some important issues as to, if we libertarians take property rights seriously, then I think we have to think through very carefully as to what constitutes property violations. If we take rights seriously, we need to think through what sort of actions actually are rights violative. And I think it's useful to at least give some consideration to these matters. Perhaps a more interesting way of framing an issue like this is, let's say that people in another country engage in actions that suggest an intent to launch an attack against my community that use weapons which will kill many and for which there's no effective defense. Is it permissible for me to engage in some form of preemptive action? I'm old enough to remember the Cuban Missile Crisis. Now, I don't know that that would necessarily, I'm not sure that we can say that Cuba clearly demonstrated an intent to launch an attack. In fact, I don't think the evidence indicates that they were planning to launch an attack. But there are situations in which perhaps we see signs, perhaps we have what we would all consider good evidence that folks over the hill are going to launch a great big fricking missile against us, and when they launch it, there's really nothing we can do about it except stand around and die. Are we required to basically wait until they launch such a weapon before we engage in some form of defensive action? And would it be permissible, if we believe that our lives are in danger, can we engage in some form of preemptive action? Again, the example that I used, do I have to wait until, do you have to wait until I fire my pistol before you take some form of defensive action? And so sometimes these questions, perhaps the answers are easy in certain cases, perhaps they're a little harder in others. Another challenge, and again, I think this is one that libertarians perhaps do not address or do not invest with the degree of importance that I think is worthy or is warranted, involves issues of children, dealing with ages of majority questions. What are the rights of children? And what are the obligations of parents? And you'll note that in this situation, here's a situation where the relationship between the actors is not really, or it's not clear, it's really a market relationship. In most cases, when we talk about the libertarian perspective, we're talking about relationships between adults. And we're talking about, in some sense, market relationships. Here's a situation where it's not at all obvious that the term market is really appropriate in dealing with the rights of children, the obligation of parents. Now, my experience, again, based on many years dealing with libertarians, is that libertarians differ widely in their views about the rights of children and the responsibilities of parents. You will get a very wide degree of difference between libertarians on these issues. In fact, you might ask the question, given that we're talking about challenges to liberty, why is this here? Because perhaps one might say, well, are the challenges to liberty from people who, in a sense, come from outside the libertarian perspective? Well, in this case, no. These challenges are ones, as I said, challenges for liberty might be the better phrase. These are issues that I think we need to consider seriously because a lot of very important public policy questions involve rights that are in question concerning children and parents. For example, if I spank my daughter, and by the way, when I say I spank my daughter, I haven't committed parenthood yet. I don't have any children, so these are these are figures of speech. If I spank my daughter, am I violating her rights? And does the answer that you give to that question perhaps depend upon why I spanked her? If I noticed that my daughter was likely to put her hand on a very hot stove, and I spanked her to indicate to her that she should not put her hand on the stove, I did it for the purpose of protecting her, giving her a minor pain so that she understands not to put her hand on something that would cause her major pain, is it okay in that case? So I asked, does the answer that you would give concerning the violation of her rights if I spank her, does that answer depend upon the reason I spanked her? Maybe yes, maybe no. Do I have an obligation to care for my children? In other words, if I go out and commit parenthood, do I have an obligation to care for them? Do I have an obligation to feed them? As you may know, there are libertarians who would say that under certain circumstances that's not the case, at least assuming certain issues or certain requirements have been fulfilled, that I don't necessarily have an obligation to feed my children, even very young children. If you do believe that I have an obligation, for example, to feed my son, do I have an obligation to feed him well? Do I have an obligation to make sure that he gets a properly nutritionally balanced diet? By the way, questions of these sorts pop up all the time in public policy issues, and they go right to the heart of some very, very difficult matters that in some cases have very painful outcomes. If I'm driving a car and I choose to bring my young child with me, am I required to take special precautions concerning my child's safety? In other words, let's say that if some legislature requires me to strap my son or my daughter into some sort of special seat, or perhaps if they don't require the specific technology of a special car seat, maybe they require me to take special precautions. They give me latitude with respect to a suite of different precautions, but they do require special precautions. Am I putting my child at risk by virtue of driving the child around without putting the child in some sort of special car seat? Should parents be required to have their very young children vaccinated to protect the children against dread diseases? There are all sorts of diseases to which children perhaps are particularly vulnerable. Some of these diseases are fatal. We have, in many cases, accidents that might help prevent the children from succumbing to those dread diseases, but those vaccinations in some cases have their own side effects. It's possible, for example, that for a very small fraction of the population of young children, those small children will die or at least suffer severe injury by virtue of side effects or reactions to the vaccination. Is it appropriate for parents to be required to have their very young children vaccinated for the protection of the children? Also, sometimes questions come about if you're going to send your children, say, to public schools. Should you be required to vaccinate those children against highly contagious infectious diseases? Again, these are interesting public policy questions. I actually knew a family whose daughter had suffered a severe debilitating reaction to a vaccination. They did not want to have their daughter vaccinated. She was vaccinated, and she suffered a reaction. Is the notion of age of consent laws, is it legitimate? Should we have age of consent laws? And if so, how would we determine an appropriate age for age of consent laws? These age of consent laws involve things such as contracts. Do we immediately say that if someone is below a certain age, we will not recognize the contracts they sign? Or perhaps we will not recognize them unless they can demonstrate some ability to specify that they understand the nature of the contracts? An important question is, are laws regulating employment of children improper? We have child labor laws in this country. In fact, many countries around the world have child labor laws. Some don't. Is there something fundamentally appropriate or fundamentally inappropriate about having laws that regulate the employment of children? If I want to send my 5-year-old son off to work in the coal mines where it's very, very dangerous, I want the child to go off and work because the child will be paid perhaps a little something that I will then take from the child, perhaps giving him a small allowance. Is it appropriate to have some sort of laws that regulate the employment in children, or perhaps regulate the employment in what we might refer to as dangerous injuries? As a libertarian, I tend to think that it's not really appropriate to have child labor laws, but I understand there are very good reasons why people might think that given the relationship between a parent and a child, that it's not really a relationship in which the child perhaps has what one might consider appropriate ability to refuse to go to work. Is it appropriate to have laws for the protection of such children? Of course, we should be mindful that in many cases laws that are put forward as being for the benefit of children for their protection perhaps are nothing more than labor protectionist legislation masquerading as child welfare legislation. And the fourth challenge that I would like to talk about is one that has become, in many cases, a hot topic by virtue of the publication of a book called Nudge, which I'll talk about briefly in a moment. Is it possible for, what I put in quotation marks, sensible coercion to provide superior outcomes to those produced by the market? Now, some people might object to my use of sensible coercion. They might feel that that's an unduly pejorative phrase, that they might prefer another, perhaps less pejorative phrase. All right, if so, okay, I'll accept that as a something for correction for next time. But is it possible for government to provide some sort of nudge, to use the Thaler and Sunstein phrase, that might actually give us superior outcomes? You'll note at the bottom of the page I have a parenthetical question. Does Thomas Schelling's example of hockey helmets apply here? It refers to the previous question of, can forcing everyone to take a particular action produce an outcome that each participant agrees would be better than the outcome that would emerge absent that coercion? And I'm thinking of the example Tom Schelling used. By the way, Thomas Schelling was a Nobel laureate in economics who talked about the idea of the National Hockey League requiring all hockey players to wear helmets. And his point was that hockey players generally thought it was a good idea to wear hockey helmets. They realized that hockey's a dangerous sport, and many hockey players evinced evidence that they wanted to wear hockey helmets, but no one wanted to be the first player to wear a hockey helmet, lest he be thought to be a soft guy, a sissy. And Mr. Schelling's, what I think was a very interesting example, was that here was a situation where collective action, in other words, you don't play if you don't wear a hockey helmet, collective action and a form of coercion basically imposed or led to a better outcome. Now, I put the quotation, excuse me, I put the question mark after the question I asked about Mr. Schelling's example, because one might reasonably inquire, is this a fair question, or does it really apply? Does Schelling's example of hockey helmets apply in the case of government coercion versus, say, the National Hockey League? Fair question. The reason I mention this is because I think Schelling's example gets us to think seriously about what I believe is an interesting question. Is it possible that we could have a situation whereby forcing everyone to engage in a particular action, to take some particular step, that we might actually get a superior outcome, and superior with respect to every participant's notion? And it strikes me as at least possible. I don't know how likely it is, but it strikes me as at least possible. A major question that is posed to people of libertarian disposition is, if we don't have a taxation system, will so-called public goods be provided in sufficient quantity? And let me step forward. The classic definition of a public good is that it's a good such that my consumption of that good doesn't preclude you from your ability to enjoy it, doesn't preclude your ability to consume it, and you can't be excluded from enjoying the good even if you didn't pay for it. In the fancy terms, the more formal economics terms, consumption of this so-called public good, it's non-rivalrous and non-excludable. So if we have such things as public goods, and by the way, some economists do question as to whether or not public goods actually exist. Is there anything that really qualifies as a public good? But if they do exist, will we get a sufficient amount of those goods absent some form of taxation? And the classic example, one that is frequently offered to people of libertarian disposition as a criticism of a prospective libertarian society, is, would we have a sufficient amount of national defense to be provided absent taxation? Another question from another Nobel laureate, actually, is, should markets with a substantial informational asymmetries between buyer and seller, should these markets be regulated to produce better outcomes? And in many ways, the classic example is George Akerlof's example of the so-called lemons markets. In other words, you go out to buy a used car. The used car may have some defects. There may be substantial asymmetry on the part of the person who first owned the used car. Either that's the used car dealer or the person who sold the used car to the dealer. Is there an asymmetry here of information? Well, likely yes. Perhaps the guy who has the used car dealer, he may know about all of the imperfections. These imperfections may be very difficult for the buyer to obtain via some sort of casual inspection. Now, it's quite possible, of course, that the used car dealer, being a man of surpassing virtue, might reveal any and all flaws, but there are signs that that doesn't always happen. And so in Akerlof's work, he basically asked, are there situations where if we have markets where there is likely to be a substantial degree of asymmetry between the knowledge available to the buyer and the knowledge available to the seller, and it could be that the buyer is in the better position, it could be that the seller is in the better position. You could have informational asymmetries either direction. Would we be better off if we have some form of regulation of those markets? And I think he raises an interesting question. Can we nudge people toward improved behavior by judicious use of governmental power? For example, if we don't have a governmental old age pension system, we don't have Social Security as it's currently known, but we require people to set money aside for their own pensions. This is the system, as I understand it, that's used in Chile. Could we get a markedly better outcome by a little bit, or what advocates would say is a little bit of coercion here and there? Can we actually produce outcomes that we would all stand back and look and say, yes, basically these are better outcomes? And I mentioned the book Nudge. Richard Thaler and Cass Sunstein, who are professors, I'm not sure right now where they are. They've been at the University of Chicago Law School. Of course, Cass Sunstein has been involved with advising Barack Obama about various matters. They have written a very interesting and provocative book that I think libertarians should read when they have the opportunity, because I think it does raise some interesting questions that we should at least be able to address. Now, we may address them in different ways than other people, but I think we should at least be able to look at these questions and come up with some sort of response. I note here that I'm not sure that one can prove anything as to whether or not nudging is going to be, on balance, a good thing. As with so many examples of governmental activity, governmental work, it very well may be that we nudge and the good results are immediately observable, but the bad results are not. And this happens many times. So it's not clear to me, at least on a priori grounds, whether nudging would bring about good results. So I've included some brief references, which I'll make these I'll make these slides available to you. I just simply provided the citations here. There are many other references concerning the criticisms. If I went on to list those, it would be too numerous to put here. But I thought that these references might be particularly useful as you start to think about these issues, or perhaps as you continue to think about these issues. So with that, I'd like to thank you again for taking the time and trouble to participate in this webinar. If you have any questions, comments, arguments, if you think, hey, this was a great webinar, I really learned something, please drop me an email. If you think I'm as dumb as a post and this was a complete waste of your time, please drop me an email and let me know. I might cry myself to sleep, but it would be helpful for me to know. And with that, let me open it up to questions, comments, or perhaps even arguments.
All right, Dr. Lark, the first one's coming from Trevor Burris. Says, sorry, too many people typing. When do practical concerns affect theoretical concerns, and should they? More specifically, how do you feel about libertarians or other political philosophers like socialists who ignore practical concerns to maintain theoretical purity? Is practicality a principled position, or is it just a cop-out?
That's an excellent question. I think we should always consider practicality. I should note that I am a libertarian on moral grounds. I think that societies based on libertarian principles will get more goods out of the woods, to use Robert Anderson's felicitous phrase, but I'm a libertarian on moral grounds. I think that there are certain things that government simply cannot do. It simply has no right to do it as a matter of morals. And so I believe that you have to go on your moral, you have to go according to your moral principles. But I think to ignore practical issues is, if nothing else, you need to be willing to say, I've looked at this, I think these are the prudential consequences of the society whose principles I embrace, and I'm willing to live with them. I don't think that it's appropriate for us. I think we have to look at the practical consequences, but ultimately I think our moral guidelines should carry weight. The interesting feature for many of those who argue in favor of moral perspective is that they claim to be helping certain groups of people. In fact, they adopt a political framework, a particular political a set of political policies, because they claim to want to help the poor or the sick. And in those cases, those people pretty much by definition have to look at the practical consequences of what they advocate, precisely because they're claiming they are advocating particular societal vision, particular societal institutions on behalf or for the benefit of certain people. So in those cases, they have to look at practical issues. Now, I don't know if that answers the gentleman's question. I hope it does.
Okay, the next question comes from Brian Lentz. When you talked about the rights of children, it reminded me of an issue that I just can't find an answer to. It deals with Christian scientists who don't believe in medical treatment. Now, that's fine for adults who can make the decision about whether to accept medical treatment or not, but what if their child is sick? Can the parent withhold medical treatment?
That's actually the gentleman has, I mean, he's asking a question that actually motivated part of the reason I put this in here. Frankly, I have my notions, but that's all there are. I don't know. I think if you asked 100 different libertarians, you would get at least you would probably have at least 3 different answers. I know at least 2, and I suspect you'd have substantial numbers of people on plumping for different answers. I think it depends on the nature of how you view this. I tend to think that there's really no good answer here. I'm not comfortable with either answer. That may sound like a cop-out. I don't like government stepping in, and I don't like anybody stepping in and saying, we're going to treat your son or daughter over your objections. On the other hand, as the gentleman quite properly points out, if we have a situation where, for example, someone is bleeding to death and the parents say, look, divine providence will either determine or it will determine whether or not our son lives. If it's divine providence that he survive, he'll stop bleeding. If it's divine providence that he pass away, then he'll keep bleeding and die. If somebody is able to stop the bleeding, I guess I would stop the bleeding, but I don't feel at all comfortable with that. Unfortunately, if I may digress very briefly, it's not so much a digression, but if I may offer an obiter dictum, unfortunately, the world is full of situations where you have unpleasant choices. And one of the things that I hope libertarians will develop, if they haven't already done so, a sense of humility. A lot of times when we have unpleasant situations, it's not because we have evil people on one side or the other. It's because life is pretty damned hard in many cases. In some cases, we have legitimate concerns on both sides or all sides of the issue. Now, I don't know if that makes me sound like a squish on certain things, but this is one of those questions, and again, it's an excellent question, as was the first question. I'm not sure there's a good answer to this, and I think that libertarians can come down on either side, and I've heard libertarians come down on either side of that issue.
Okay, the next question comes from Stephen Holloman. What are your thoughts on intellectual property? Do people have rights to ideas and patents on them?
Boy, you talk about a hornet's nest. Boy, 3 excellent questions in a row. I personally think that a lot of intellectual property is not really property, and I think, for example, issues of patents. I've always been very queasy about the notion of patents. I understand the economic justification for them. I find it hard to say that because you happen to get, if you develop an idea independently of me, but I happen to get to the patent office 15 minutes ahead of you, that that I should have the right to foreclose you from developing your idea. So I've never been, I guess I would say I'm not in favor of patents, at least not as patents are currently constituted. Copyright's a somewhat different issue. I think that I think one can construct copyright law to conform with libertarian principles. But I know there are some libertarians. In fact, when I was in Milan at the European Liberty Conference, acquaintance of mine, Michele Boldrin, Professor Boldrin, was part of a panel dealing with sort of the anti-intellectual property movement. He seems to subscribe to the notion that intellectual property really isn't property. And I think one can build a very, very good case. And a lot of my friends, by the way, are very suspicious of any sort of notions of intellectual property. So that's, by the way, I follow various libertarian authors, and there's an interesting little dispute that's been going on between one author, a fairly prominent libertarian, and critics who say that this author really doesn't have a right to, that it's really not his intellectual property. I'm not sure that I'm doing complete justice to this little argument. I've observed it from afar, but I do notice that this is a particularly hot topic among some libertarians at this time.
Unfortunately, everyone, this is going to be the last question. I know we've got about 24 lined up or so.
Oh, heavens.
If you would like these questions answered, I'm sure you can send them to us and Dr. Lark, and he can answer them as best he can.
Absolutely. I will endeavor to answer them, although I will point out that I'm not sure how quickly I can get around. I'm up to my neck with all manner of faculty stuff. But if you have a question and you think I might be able to answer it, you're welcome to send it along, and I'll do my best. The worst that'll happen if you send it to me is I'll say, can you please give me a little time to think about it, or a little time to respond.
All right. Well, the last question is from Carl Oberg. Many of these critiques are about superior outcomes. But is it government's job to provide for better outcomes, or is it just the government's role to protect property rights only?
Well, congratulations to all those who've asked questions, because I think all 4 questions are excellent. In my opinion, government's job is to provide for protection of rights. It's not to secure superior outcomes. If the mechanism by which those superior outcomes are obtained violate the basic moral principles that I feel undergird the society, the libertarian society. By the way, an important point about the criticisms of libertarian society. In many cases, people talk about, just as sometimes libertarians talk about property rights very promiscuously without really perhaps knowing what they're talking about. A lot of times people talk about government mechanisms producing superior outcomes. Well, in many cases, those people are frankly talking through their hat, because in some cases, absent a market, it's not possible to know what the optimal outcome is. People are using governmental instruments to try to secure an optimal outcome. They have no way of knowing what that optimal outcome is. And so when people talk about, well, we can use governmental mechanisms to secure or promote superior outcomes, in many cases, their notion of a superior outcome is just that. It's their notion. There's really nothing objective behind that notion. Now, they may be able to support it in a reasonable manner, but they're basically, in my opinion, in some cases talking through their hat. So, again, I'd like to thank everyone for their excellent questions, and thank you for taking the time and trouble to participate. I hope you found this interesting. Maybe, again, some of you found this a bit old hat. If so, I apologize that you took your valuable time for this purpose. But I hope you found it interesting and thought-provoking. And any comments and questions that you want to relay to me, please do so.
All right, thank you very much, everybody. As I mentioned earlier, we're going to make sure and get these slides out to you soon so that you can go through them again if you'd like. Our next webinar is going to be next Monday, November 25th. Dr. Bill Glott of the Institute for Humane Studies is joining us again to discuss how to get funded at a strong PhD program. Shortly, you'll be emailed a follow-up survey to the webinar. Please take a quick minute to fill it out. It helps us let us know how to improve the programs and make these webinars more interesting. Thank you, Dr. Lark, and thank you for all the participation.
You're quite welcome. Again, thanks to all the attendees.